A white officer halts a black judge at the courthouse, but what happens next is shocking. Leah Marshall was running late once again as she pulled up to the New Orleans courthouse. She checked the time on her car's dashboard. 10 minutes to go until the trial began. Her heart rate quickened slightly. Today was the day she had both feared and meticulously prepared for. This was the start of a high-profile case that had the potential to reshape how racial profiling was approached in Louisiana for good. Leah stepped out of her car, took a deep breath, and squared her shoulders, embodying the confident stance of an accomplished black judge. She had faced plenty of challenges throughout her legal career, but the weight of this case felt particularly heavy. This wasn't just any trial, it was personal. The defendant, a young black man named Kevin Daniels, had been detained in his own neighborhood without cause. The officer who apprehended him claimed he resembled someone involved in suspicious activities. The situation sounded far too familiar. As Leah walked across the parking lot, her heels echoing sharply against the pavement, she chose to enter through a side door instead of the grand entrance. The main steps were crowded with reporters, cameras at the ready for the day's headline. She had no time to deal with the media circus. When she reached the side door, a young white police officer stood watch. His posture was stiff, his gaze following her every move as she approached. Leah instinctively reached for her ID badge hanging from her neck, but before she could show it to him, the officer blocked her way. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your identification," he said, his voice sharp. Leah raised an eyebrow, taken aback by his insistence. "I'm Judge Marshall," she replied, holding her badge higher for him to see. "I'm presiding over the Daniels case today." The officer didn't even glance at her badge. His cold eyes scanned her from head to toe, calculating. Leah could feel her anger bubbling up, but she forced herself to stay composed. "There's been an incident nearby, and you match the description of someone involved. I'm going to need to ask you a few questions," he continued with suspicion in his voice. Leah stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand what was unfolding. The irony was suffocating. She was about to oversee a trial centered on racial profiling, and here she was, being racially profiled at the courthouse. "Officer," she said, her voice firm despite the tension in her chest. "I don't have time for this. The trial starts in less than 10 minutes, and I need to get inside." She held out her badge again, silently urging him to recognize his error. But the officer remained unmoved. His hand hovered near his belt, close to his handcuffs. "I don't care who you say you are, ma'am," he snapped, stepping closer. "You'll need to come with me." Leah's pulse quickened. This was escalating quickly. She could see the look in his eyes, one she had seen too many times before, growing up in the South, a mix of suspicion and disdain. It wasn't about her being a judge, it was about her being black. Before she could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Leah turned to see an older black officer approaching, his expression one of surprise and concern. "Marshall," he said, his eyes widening as he recognized her. "Yes," Leah replied, her voice tight. The older officer shot a glance at the younger one. "Stand down," he ordered firmly. The younger officer, still seething, muttered, "She matches the description," but the older officer snapped back, "That's the judge." Do you want to lose your job?" The younger officer mumbled something inaudible, his anger dissipating as he reluctantly stepped back. Leah forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. She couldn't afford to lose her temper now. "Are you okay, ma'am?" the older officer asked softly. Leah nodded, her jaw clenched. "I'm fine, thank you." Without another word, she walked into the courthouse, her heart still racing. Inside, the familiar sterile halls offered her a sense of routine, but the earlier scene kept replaying in her mind. She had faced racism her entire life, but to experience it like this on the day of this trial was almost too much to bear. The courtroom quieted as Leah struck the gavel, calling the room to order. The trial began with opening statements from both sides, but Leah's thoughts continued to wander back to the officer outside, the cold look in his eyes, the way he had judged her instantly. It felt too close to the case she was now overseeing. Then came the first witness, Kevin Daniels himself. As he took the stand, his testimony was raw and heartbreaking. He described how he had been stopped by police simply for walking in his own neighborhood. He hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't acted suspiciously, yet he had been treated like a criminal. Handcuffed and humiliated in front of his neighbors. Leah felt the weight of his words, more deeply than ever before. She had heard stories like his countless times, but today, it felt different. It wasn't just about Kevin Daniels, it was about the many others like him. And it was about her. Halfway through his testimony, the courtroom door creaked open, and Leah's stomach sank. It was the young officer from earlier. He walked in, looking pale and tense, clearly uneasy. Leah's eyes locked onto him, her nerves taut. The prosecutor called him to the stand. "We would like to call Officer Bill Wilkins." Leah hadn't caught his name before, but now, she watched as he took the stand. His body was stiff, his movements awkward. She reminded herself to remain impartial, but it was hard. This was the same officer who had stopped her outside, treating her as a suspect instead of a judge. Bill squirmed in his seat. The prosecutor began to ask him about his role in Kevin Daniels' arrest. "I was patrolling when I saw Daniels," Bill began, his voice lacking the confidence from earlier. He looked out of place. Like he didn't belong there." Leah's grip on her gavel tightened. Out of place, she had heard that phrase too many times before. It was code for, "He's black, and I didn't think he should be there." The prosecutor pressed on. "What made Mr. Daniels look out of place, Officer Wilkins?" Bill shifted uncomfortably, clearly nervous. "He seemed like he was up to something," he muttered. Leah felt her anger rise again. She knew the facts. Daniels had been waiting for a ride share. No crime, no suspicious behavior. Just a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, according to the police. The prosecutor continued, "Did you find anything on Mr. Daniels that suggested he had committed a crime?" Bill hesitated. His face flushed. "No," he admitted. "We didn't." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Leah could feel the tension building, heavy and palpable. She glanced at the jury. Some seemed moved, others conflicted. But the truth was undeniable: Kevin Daniels had been arrested simply because he was black. Bill's testimony began to unravel with each question. Small inconsistencies crept into his story. Leah kept her eyes on him, noticing how his gaze flickered toward her, filled with discomfort. He knew who she was now, and he knew exactly what he had done. By the end of the day, the defense had tried to paint Bill as a well-meaning officer who had simply made an honest mistake. But Leah knew the truth, and so did the prosecutor, Samantha Green. When it was time for Samantha's final argument, she addressed the jury with a voice full of conviction. "This case isn't just about Kevin Daniels," she said. "It's about a pattern we've seen far too often in our justice system. It's about officers like Bill Wilkins, who see a young black man in a neighborhood and assume he must be up to no good. It's about how these assumptions lead to wrongful arrests, humiliation, and injustice. It's time to say enough." The courtroom fell silent, Leah feeling the shift in the air. The jury was listening. They understood. When the trial concluded, Leah dismissed the court for the day. But she remained seated for a moment longer, her thoughts racing. She had done her job, presiding over the case fairly, but the incident outside the courthouse continued to gnaw at her. It was a painful reminder that no matter her position, no matter her accomplishments, she would always be viewed through the lens of her race. Then, Sergeant Michael Harris, the older officer who had intervened earlier, walked into the courtroom. He approached her quietly, his face lined with concern. "Judge Marshall, can I speak with you for a moment?" Surprised, Leah looked up. "Of course." Harris sighed, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I wanted to talk about what happened with Wilkins earlier. He's not a bad kid. He's just got blind spots. Like a lot of them." Leah studied him, her expression unreadable. "Blind spots?" she repeated bitterly. "You mean racism?" Harris winced but didn't deny it. "Maybe. But I want you to know, I'm trying to fix it from the inside." Leah studied him for a long moment. She wanted to believe him, to hold on to the hope that real change was possible. But after everything she had witnessed, it was difficult to trust. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked quietly. "When I sit here day after day, hearing cases like this, knowing what I've experienced firsthand." Harris fell silent for a long moment before replying. "You keep doing what you're doing, Judge. You keep holding people accountable. That's the only way things will change." Leah nodded slowly. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. The trial wasn't over yet, and there were more battles ahead. But for today, at least, she had taken a step forward. Leah took a deep breath, her gaze steady on Officer Wilkins as she processed his words. There was something almost pitiable in his posture, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his guilt and realization. But her feelings remained guarded. "Officer Wilkins," she said, her tone measured but firm, "the truth is, the system you represent has been broken for a long time. Your actions are not isolated. They're a reflection of a culture that's allowed these biases to exist, unchecked, for generations." Bill lowered his gaze, his eyes welling with unshed tears. He swallowed hard but didn't speak immediately. "I don't think you understand," Leah continued, her voice softer now, almost resigned. "This isn't just about you being wrong in one instance. It's about the entire framework that allowed you to think that way, to act that way without any fear of consequence. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his failings, but he was still grappling with his own internal struggle. I didn't see it at the time, he said quietly. I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was doing what I was trained to do. But now I know I was wrong. Leah could hear the shame in his voice, but it didn't make her soften. She had seen too many people go through the same motions. She'd seen the apologies, the promises to do better. But in the end, nothing ever really changed. She shook her head, as if trying to release the weight of the conversation. You're not the first to say that, Officer Wilkins. But every apology, every excuse, every attempt to absolve yourself, it doesn't change what's happened. It doesn't change the lives that have been destroyed, the families that have been shattered. No one can undo the damage that's been done. Bill's face twisted in a silent battle. I want to change, he murmured. I want to make things right. I can't just pretend this didn't happen. Leah stood there, still unmoving. His words were sincere, but they didn't erase the past. They didn't erase the countless others who had faced the same injustices. And in that moment, she realized that nothing would ever truly be enough to fix what was broken. Not from him. Not from anyone. I hope you do change, Officer Wilkins, she finally said, her voice cold once more. But it's going to take more than just your apology. It's going to take real, systemic change. And that's not something you can do alone. Bill didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands trembling slightly, as though trying to find some final words, something that could shift the weight of his actions. Goodbye, Officer Wilkins, Leah said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence between them. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her steps purposeful but heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. As she left the courthouse and stepped into the cool air of the evening, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the small victory today, nothing had really changed. The weight of the system's flaws was still there, unyielding. But she would keep fighting. She had no choice. Because, as much as she wanted to believe in change, the truth was that it wouldn't come without tireless work, and even then, it would be slow. One step forward, but 1,000 more to go.